Hey guys, Brody here, and today we're going to be talking about context in React 16.3 and how you can use context to define state in a top-level area of your application and pass down values, being state and whatever else you want, to children components without having to explicitly define the prop passing down. So to start off, I'm here on the context doc page on reactjs.org. If you want to take a second and pause the video and read through this, you can, just to get a little bit more reference on the API and how to use it, but I'm going to explain to you how to. So if we switch over here, I have a basic counter application that I built out previously that you can clone off of my GitHub. I'll have a link below, and you can kind of follow along here as I explain to you guys how to use this API. So to get started, I have my package.json here, which you can kind of reference. I have a basic Babel setup and an ESLint setup. And of course, I'm using Parcel. I usually use Parcel just to get some things up and running quickly without any configuration. It's really awesome. I'll have a link below to that as well. I have basic ESLint configuration, and I have my Babel preset configuration. So I have env and stage 0 set up for my presets. And of course, I have transform class properties for my plugins. And I have an app.js file, which is just rendering a div, and then my count component here, which is my counter. I have a CSS skeleton set up for you guys. I have an index.html file, and I have my index.js, which has a provider, and my main application here, my app component, which is inside of the provider, and we're rendering that to root. So if you want to switch over to the terminal here, I'm going to run npm run dev to spin up the dev instance server, and go to localhost 1234, and this should open up our application. I'm going to go to the inspector here for future reference. Don't worry about this log right now. But as you can see here, we have a counter app, which is not doing anything, and we're going to hook this up and get some context going. So switching back to index.js, we have a provider here and the app, which is being rendered inside of it as children. And if I switch into my provider here, you can see that I have a basic stateful component, and I have, right now it's just rendering children, but we're going to set up context, we're going to set up a provider, and then we're going to create a higher order component, which is a consumer, which is going to throw whatever value we're passing into the provider down to the component which we're wrapping. So to give you some more context into what context is, it is an API, like I said, to define what to pass down to children without having to explicitly pass the props down to every single component. So if you're familiar with Redux or MobX, you will be familiar with Context API. You might not know it, but these modules, these third-party libraries, are using context under the scene or under the hood. So to get started with context, I'm going to create a constant here called context, and it's going to be equal to react.createContext, and I'm going to assign that to the exports object here. And if I log this and I switch over to my browser here, you will see that this has a consumer and a provider key on this object, and this consumer here is going to be consuming whatever we're passing into the provider. And I'll demonstrate that here for you guys. So instead of rendering children in this provider component, we're going to be rendering context.provider, and I'm going to close this, and I'm going to just render some children inside of it like I was doing a second ago. And if I save this and switch back to my browser, I can refresh and see that everything's working the same. And what we're going to do here is we're going to say value. And this value that we're describing is going to be what we're passing down to this provider, which will be implicitly passed to every single child of this provider. So I'm going to say model here, and this model is going to be equal to this.state. And this is all we're going to do right now. So if I switch back to the browser, everything's okay. And say I want to add some default state. So I can say count is equal to 0. And without saving this, if I switch over to my count component, I'm rendering some JSX in here, and I'm console.logging model. And keep this in mind. I'm going to be showing you guys this change here in a second. But I'm going to save this. It's going to give me an ESLint error because I'm not using count in this component, but don't worry about that right now. And if I save and refresh, everything is good to go. And I'm actually going to switch over to this higher order component now because we're going to create a consumer of this provider. So we're going to call this higher order component with state. If you're familiar with Redux Connect, we're going to be pretty much doing the same thing here, but a little less in depth. So this with state is going to be a function that takes in a component. We're going to call this composed component, if I can spell. There we go. And it's going to take in some props here, this component that it returns, and we're going to be rendering. Got to import context from provider, and this with state is going to be rendering context.consumer. And this context.consumer is a little different. If you're familiar with function as a child higher order components, then you will find this relative to what you've already been learning. So what we're going to do is we're going to define an anonymous function in here. And this anonymous function is going to be passed an object, which we're defining right here as this value. And we're going to pull off this model that we're defining. So this provider is passing some values down to the consumer, and it's going to end up right here in this function. So I'm going to say model, and I'm going to return composed component here. And I'm going to code this out and I'll explain to you what I'm doing. So composed component is going to say model is equal to model because we want to pass this down to every single component. And I'm going to spread some props in there. And if I save this, ESLint will configure itself. This is still good to go. And if I refresh, everything should be fine. Now, as you can see here, we're still not receiving anything. And that's because we have this higher order component, but we don't have it hooked up to this count component yet. So if you import with state from hoc/with state, and all you have to do is just wrap this count component with state, save it, and if we switch over to our inspector here in our console, we can see that we're now connected to this provider because we're receiving this count model, as you can see here. So I can get rid of this 0, this OR, save it, go back, and we're still good. So now to set up some state manipulation, it's pretty much the same way. So if you want to have a method here called increment counter, which is just a function that sets state. Let me code this out quick. This is going to return a new object, which will be our state. And I'm going to say count plus 1. So we have this method here, which is going to be manipulating our state. Let me just fix this a little bit. Oh, I guess ESLint doesn't like that. All right, so we have increment counter here. And if we want to pass our methods down to our consumer, we can do this right here. We can say actions, and actions is going to be equal to a getter here. So we can do this dot actions, and all we have to do is say get actions, turn an object, and we're going to say increment counter is equal to this dot increment counter. If we save this, we should go back to our browser and see that there's no errors. And all we have to do is switch into our higher order component, because right now we're only pulling off model, but we're passing down model and actions. So we can say model actions, actions equals actions, and switch into our count component here and pull off actions as well from props. And let's add another console.log here. Our actions, we'll console.log that, and see right now we're pulling off increment counter. So let's take increment counter here and hook that up to our increment button. So if we say on click is equal to actions.increment counter, this should work. So let's save this, and we're incrementing some state. And I'll go ahead and do the same thing for you guys in here just to show the decrement. So we'll copy this, we'll paste it, decrement counter. And instead of incrementing, we're going to be minusing, or subtracting, I should say. We're going to say decrement counter equals this dot decrement counter. We go back here, we'll have two functions now being passed to this count component. So now we can say on click is equal to actions dot decrement counter. Now I'm able to increment and decrement this counter. So real quick before I end this video, just gonna go over exactly what we did one more time. We have a provider here, which is creating some state. We have a provider here, which is wrapping all of our children, which we're defining right here. And once again, if you've seen Redux providers, this is what's working behind the scenes. And we're telling this provider to pass down our model and our actions to our consumer. And our actions are right here, and this is going to be manipulating this state right here. And we have a higher order component called withState, super simple higher order component, which just takes in a component, which we're doing right here. This withState is taken in this count component. We're returning another function here, which takes in props. And from this component right here, we're going to return a context.consumer. So we're saying I'm going to consume this model and actions from our provider, and I'm going to pass it to whatever component I'm wrapping, which in this case is count. And count then is pulling off model and actions from props, and is rendering some JSX, which is our model.count and our actions. And we're able to increment and decrement this state. So I know this isn't too in-depth, but I just wanted to show you guys how simple it is to set up context in an application to do basic or complex state manipulation and pass down values to components deep in the component tree without having to explicitly define that. As you can see here, I have my app, which is inside of my provider, and my app is rendering this count, and I'm not passing any props down. This count is receiving everything from this provider just by wrapping it with this consumer higher order component. So if you guys enjoyed this video, please feel free to like and subscribe. I'll be creating some more helpful videos in the future. Thanks for watching.